to the Interverse. It's an illusion.
Welcome to the One Within All, to another episode of Interverse. I'm your host, Chance, coming to you in our first conversation on the other side of the big Plutonian shift from Capricorn into Aquarius, which, whether or not you're feeling immediately in your personal life or you have a different perspective on the effects based on a true sky sidereal system, this is a change of tone in our heavens that is surely going to have some far-reaching ramifications in the world below. And I've always found it fascinating that Pluto was officially discovered at the same time as Western psychology's introduction of the theory of the unconscious, meaning that this outermost of wandering stars is forever associated with the inevitable enantiodromia and revelation of bringing that which is hidden into the light. Considering the implications of Aquarius's domains, particularly in how individuals relate within networks and collectives, and the circulatory systems both within us and without, for those of us in alignment with the sky clock, the next couple of decades will be about the renovation of our communities and our resource supply chains on the external, and the potential for revolutionary new applications for the generation of true wealth through the knowledge of how natural systems of energy transmission, such as electricity and magnetism, can be harmonized with our food production and the regulation of dissonant electrical environments created over the previous century. And the icing on this Plutonian cake is the fresh perspective we're all being offered about how our unconscious beliefs and expectations are creating either negative and necrophilic feedback loops or life-affirming and expanding potentiation pathways. Here at the perfect moment to strike a proper tone at this exact instant of cosmic coincidences is our returning guest, Dr. Moshe Daniel Block, an electro-cultivated one-man renaissance of Kabbalistic wisdom who's applied his alignment with the universal Tao into a naturopathic medicine practice, free energy experimentation, and every other avenue one might invest into along the autodidact's path of lifelong invigorating gnosis. Life force invigorating gnosis too. We last spoke with the great Moshe back in April of 2023, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what we conjure in today's conversation. But before we do that, I want to remind you that in the episode description, wherever you're hearing this, there will be links to Dr. Moshe's website, along with all the ways you can support Interverse, such as the epic biofield tuning sessions I do for those of you who want to accelerate your psychosomatic enlightenment. And don't forget that the full version of this and every other episode contains an exclusive second half that you only get as an Interverse Plus member on my Patreon, the YouTube channel membership, or the Rockfin page. And with that, everyone please join me in welcoming the healer of healers and the illness-causing false belief revealer, a man with more medicinal credentials than can be comfortably spoken aloud, the legendary Dr. Moshe Daniel. Welcome back to Interverse, man, and thanks for returning.
Hey, man. Thanks, Chance. That is a very generous account. Very poetic, too. I think I'd like to borrow some of that for any CVs that I have. Like the way you wove those terms together is very, I find it very kind of humorous in a nice way. Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's a pleasure to be back. I really enjoyed our first session. And now we're in a different moment in time. Much more intense than where we were a couple of years back. So I think it should make for a very nice discussion.
Yeah. And, just playing off of the introduction, maybe we'll just get your thoughts about this Pluto shift, or if that wasn't something on your mind, just the fact that that happened in context with geopolitics and the recent election and, the big JQ. There's so much on that plate.
JQ. It's funny. I hadn't heard about it referred to as the big JQ. I'm assuming that your listeners know what that means. JQ, the Jewish question.
The Jewish question. Yeah. Like, because that's something that really needs to be dealt with nuance, and who's better than yourself to do it?
Thank you for that. And very true that it needs to be dealt with nuance. It's complex. And I'd like to hit it after we talk about like the general implications for humanity of, because as you mentioned in your really cool sharing about Pluto moving into Aquarius obviously represents humanity. And Pluto is just basically one of the three major planets that moves, shakes, and rolls, along with Neptune and Uranus. So Uranus brings change through change, right? Like it stirs up the new. Neptune dissolves what is no longer necessary. And Pluto is just like a bomb, like destruction and death. But also great depths. So Pluto rules Scorpio and rebirth. Like Scorpio is about death, but it's also about rebirth. So we're going to be seeing things dying and being reborn around the context of humanity. And interestingly, humanity, the sign of Aquarius represents humanity. It also represents the Christ child. The child Christ that lives in humanity in each individual. So I think we're going to be seeing more and more people embodying their Christ self, waking up to it, and that becoming a reality on the planet. So very exciting times, not like boring times sitting at your armchair reading the news and sipping your coffee. It's going to be more like, there's a rocket up your butt and you're flying forward. So that's a little bit, it is very interesting for me that we've just moved into that and what's happening on the planet. So I'm sure it'll be a nice grounds for dovetailing into our other topics today.
Yeah. It's interesting that this shift is happening in the sign of Scorpio. And I alluded to this in a Vibrant last night, but maybe there's no real reason to have any particular order of topics, but how this hit for us as a family is that the moment of that transition of Pluto going out of Capricorn for good and into Aquarius, like on the dot, and this is a 20-some year odd transition, was the exact moment that we got a tongue tie revision for our daughter who had a pretty significant tongue tie. So the Capricorn and ruling restrictions, Pluto leaves that and she gets a restriction lifted. She's born in Scorpio. So Pluto is her ruling planet by modern astrology terms.
Yes.
She's also in Aquarius first house ascendant. So there's like all this crazy alignment for her that a 60-second procedure and a 20-year transit aligned and coincided in like a on the minute thing unintentionally. That blew our minds. And I think that's pretty cool. We could talk more about not just that, but like in the microcosm of my daughter's experience and in the bigger picture of humanity's transformation and a death and rebirth potentially. And I think what really illustrates the Kali Yuga, or is the best way to describe it, is the concealment of the sacred center. And that would be the invisible metaphysical center that is everywhere at once and is also like every human being being, represented astrologically by the North Pole, by the, that Polaris point. And with current humanity, one thing that's going on, because I know like 20 babies that have been born this year, all of them that I know of except one have had some kind of midline mutation, like a tongue tie or a lip tie or both, or something going on with the umbilical cord. So there's, I don't know, there's maybe nutritional reasons, maybe frequency reasons, but those are the physical reasons. And I kind of want to know what is going on a spiritual level, symbolic, Kabbalistic level with this problem with the center, the malformation of the middle that's been going on with the actual physical bodies of new humans coming in right now. Is that something that they're here to work on and heal through the external that will have some sort of impact on the collective of humanity in a Aquarian sense?
That's a great question. You're sharing this with me, and it's interesting because my kids also, who are a few years older than your child, had similar issues. And I can't say I know for sure what that represents on any sort of pattern level.
But intuition is fine.
Pardon me?
Intuiting is fine too, though. We don't have to be definite.
Yes, right. Well, tongue-tied, having issues with the tongue and speech and enunciation, it does have to do, like, that literally is with language and communication and proper communication. So these kids could be coming through with this challenge as from the past too, like this momentum of improper communication. I think humanity suffers from a huge problem communicating between one's heart, one's real feeling, one's knowing, and expressing that. So when we have like truthers like yourself and myself, people that are moving outside of the box of our societies, our religious gatherings, there's these belief systems. We hit up against this, the family, where the family's at, and then you have something that you want to say, but you hold yourself back. So there's a tongue tie. So the kids might be simply reflecting how we have had difficulty expressing the true self. It's easy just to double down on a belief system that everybody shares with you. It's easy to do that, but it's hard to speak up and to say what you want to say when you're in a crowd of people that you love, that you care about, that you want to be a part of, but that that you have this great division of ideas. So perhaps that might have something to do with it. The kids are coming through to help us resolve that. Because we really have to. When push comes to shove, you may watch a lot of awesome podcasts. You may do a lot of healing. You read all the books. But when it comes time to actually saying what you want to say to your loved ones or in your church or your synagogue, or because you have some difference there, that's when the what do you call it? The rubber meets the road, or that's when we really that's when big change can happen for the individual speaking the truth, and perhaps even planting seeds for the others to listen to that stuff.
I think you're right on the money, and it's actually a pretty good segue into going back to what we brought up, the Jewish problem or Jewish question, not to sound like a Nazi, but as soon as you say that, it's like Nazi. But, when you're with loved ones or with family and there's something being discussed where everyone's missing the elephant in the room, that like, well, what links together all of these social problems are certain influencers that all share a particular ideological label. Although in terms of like a spiritual practice, I think that is completely missing. It's more just like a liability shield. But if you try to even suggest that, like, hey, I think that there's people that are leveraging a victimhood perception to get away with stuff. And like, hey, you can't even say that. You'll get called, racist, anti-Semite. And then you ask, but how can a race and a religion be the same thing? Is it a race or is it a religion? And it just, spirals. And I've done a pretty good job being able to diplomatically introduce these ideas in my immediate family, but there's a lot of pushback at first, and I just keep going and I kind of make light of it and, lovingly talk about it. And we get there, and it's not like I want to blame anybody for problems. I just want to actually point to the root of the issue, which is, hey, victimhood is a currency in our society, and it's allowing for a lot of bad behavior to be gotten away with.
Yes.
And that's kind of where I'm at with it, but I'm sure we could go further. Like, how do we solve this?
Yes. Okay, so that's a great question. And again, it's very nuanced. So first of all, I want to start out by saying that everybody should be open to criticism by anybody. People should be allowed to criticize Israel, Jews, and point these things out. To use, the trigger sensitive anti-Semitism button it's also a part of a complexity, but it shouldn't be used as a fail-safe to not have to discuss these things, to not scrutinize it, to make it illegal, or you're not a good person if you bring them up. Like that should never be the case. But I will tell you something, like everybody that I've seen, and I say everybody truly, because I haven't heard you talk about it, Chance, or anybody else, has presented the topic very irresponsibly, in the sense that even though they make it kind of an effort to distinguish between the Jews that are involved in the higher echelons of economic power and control, it's handled in such a way that it's still talking about Jews in general, or Jewish people in general. So there are caveats sometimes made.
That's part of the cloak of it.
What's that?
That's part of the cloak of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right. Exactly. Like, this is a very complex situation that it's not easy to just put one statement down and for that to satisfy everything. Because right now, like, there is a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism happening on a global level against Jews in general. So Jews are hypersensitive to anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism equates in the Jewish psyche as invitation to kill Jews, because that's where it has often led, is to the death of Jews. I mean, there's historical examples from generation to generation to generation where Jews have been the target of hatred by certain leading power structures and people and pogroms, and let's get the Jews. Like, it's very sad. It's also I don't want to say it's comical, because it's not comical, but I think of like Borat and Ali G, it brought levity to that situation, as what is the job of comedians to do, is to bring levity to try to dispel some of the intensity around these situations.
And I'll add that moment of like, let's get them, boys, is basically the collective humanity doing what an individual person who represses their anger and won't talk about their feelings and then boils over into a rage. That's happening on the collective, because of it not being allowed to be spoken about. We run the risk of getting that boiling over point. Like, talking about it openly is actually a protective measure for everybody.
I agree. And that's why I think it's good to talk about it and to encourage criticism, to encourage anybody having whatever they want to say, so that it doesn't do the very thing that you just said, cause this repression, and then it comes out in a much worse way. And that metaphor, that analogy is actually true as well in an individual's health. Like, when you suppress anger, or you suppress some kind of expression, or you even suppress symptoms, that suppression causes a pushing back of the vital force into a stronger expression, because that expression was suppressed. So something stronger will have to come out. So I'm concerned, because I don't want to see Jewish people die. I don't want to see anybody die. I don't want to see Palestinians die. I don't want to see, Chinese people die. No, I think life is precious, and we all come from the one. Inside of our heart is a principle of the law of one, that Christ lives in each of us. So death for anybody is not anything that I'd like to see. And this has happened from generation to generation for thousands of years. And it's even written in the Torah that, I was on Alex Zek show Alex Zek, the Way Forward.
Yeah, he's great.
Awesome. It was
got
a great,
to hang with him at a Music and Sky one year. We camped next to each other. Really solid
cool.
dude.
Solid. So wonderful. So I shared some of this on his podcast, but basically there's this scene in the Torah where the Jews are attacked by Amalek in Rephidim. You know what Amalek is? It's the spiritual enemy of the Jewish people. And basically it comes right after the point when the Jews start complaining to Moses about not having something to drink and not having food. So like all these miracles happen to get the Jews out of Egypt. And then they start complaining, hey, Moses, like, why did you bring us out here in the desert? At least in Egypt, we had something to eat. We had something to drink. So they're complaining, even though there's this miraculous situation going on. And then the Amalek attack. And after the battle with Amalek, there's a statement where it says that God basically tells Moses, I have totally wiped out the memory of Amalek. They're gone. That's it. But Moses' final declaration is to say that if there is a hand against the throne of Yah, like Yahweh, that the Jewish people will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So this is a very deep secret, which I don't think you'll hear from too many conventional rabbis. But basically what it's demonstrating is that if there's a hand against the throne of Yah, that there will be war against Amalek, when the war can immediately be removed like that and never happen again if something occurs. So what is the thing? What is the hand against the throne of Yah? That's the question. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Is it people playing God themselves?
Well, for me, it's the nature. Yes.
Let me expand on that. Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's another thing to weave into here. Because one of the aspects of the so-called Jewish establishment is in the medical industry, in allopathy and big pharmaceutical companies. It's one of the places where there's an overrepresentation, right? And the word pharmakos is Greek. It refers to pharmacopoeia, like, sort of sorcery through medicine. That's how most people will know the word pharmakos. But it also is synonymous with the idea of a scapegoat. In ancient Greek religion, a pharmakos was a human scapegoat who was ritually sacrificed or exiled as a way to purify the community. And there's actually quite a lot of overlap with the ancient Greek systems and Judaism. Greek, the language, and Hebrew as a language. I think they are cut from the same cloth of a universal priesthood system, actually. And why I'm bringing this up is because I think the Jews know something about scapegoats, both in their religious practices, but also in the way that, it's part of the culture to a degree to utilize the scapegoat to deflect. And sometimes even throw their own under the bus for that reason. And that's part of the problem that needs to be talked about is, we're not going to actually solve the problem of the hand raised against the throne of Yah by scapegoating any group, Jewish or not. That will continue to perpetuate the problem. But I think that could be, why I'm bringing up pharmakos is that right now, that's one of the main ways that humanity tries to supplant God is through the practices of mainstream medicine, which I think you definitely know a thing or two about. That
I definitely know.
We try to replace the natural, only real type of healing, which comes from within and comes from, it's a mystery why you cut your arm and it has the intelligence to come back together, or why a child can be born out of the, union of the male and the female. All of that stuff is beyond the pale of human gnosis, right? But science, and particularly medicine, tries to pretend like that they can control those processes and that they can direct those processes in ways that are having widespread ramifications for the health of the human psyche and the collective and human bodies. So that's my longer-winded answer of what I meant by playing God is
Yeah.
You know, that
Well,
could
that's a
be
good
something
example.
that's against the hand. That's something that's a hand against the throne for sure.
It's a good example of a hand against the throne of Yah, because Yah, God, the one, you know, that there's many manifestations of that. So that's a good example. For me, this story in the Amalek attacking and then the hand against the throne of Yah is clearly the Jewish people being against God. And what's interesting is that, and you know, the Jewish people, they're not alone in fighting with God. Like each of us in our own way. Like when I do my sessions with my patients, I see where they're fighting with God. Like everybody's essentially fighting with God when they're not surrendered to the will of the one as it lives inside of them and yielding. So it's not like they're exclusively responsible for fighting God, but that archetype, the Jewish archetype and the fighting with God is very strong and very important to understand. And what's interesting is the name of Israel is the name that Jacob got, you know, Jacob. So there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. His name was changed to the Israel after he spent fighting all night with an angel of God. The angel represents God. So he wrestles with God, and he didn't lose though. He wrestled until the end. It's symbolic of the fact that the Jews will continue to fight with God until the end of days when they stop. And then we will have the great messianic age that we've been yearning for. I really believe that this is true, that there's this strange thing happening here that's now being revealed, and humanity is focusing its mind on it. Truthers are looking at this. We're talking about this because if there's a hand against the throat of Yah amongst the Jewish people, we're going to have this war going on, and the Jewish people have continued to, manifest this against themselves. Of course, the people who take up the mantle of trying to kill Jews or wanting to destroy Israel's existence, they have their own karma to deal with. It's not like, you know, if there's a person who has this tendency to attract abuse towards them, the abuser is not off the hook of karma. They still have issues to deal with themselves. But when I'm saying manifesting this hatred,
but there's a victim perpetrator cycle.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Both sides blend into one another. Yes,
100%, 100%. So they blend into each other. It's like a bad codependent relationship, right? And I really think that, you know, you talked about scapegoat. Interestingly, Jesus, Yeshua, is the archetypal scapegoat of the Jewish people. He was the whole thing where it says that, you know, normally the Romans, to accelerate someone's death, they would break the bones of the people on the cross, and that would stop them from holding their bodies up, and then they would fall down and they would suffocate and die from suffocation. But it specifically mentioned that Jesus was not, his bones were not broken. So he represents the goat or the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, better yet, where the bones were not broken. And that has significance for the bones that are used for the Passover ritual. So he's symbolic of this Passover scapegoat or scape lamb, like the sacrificial being. So I think that dovetails very interestingly, and also very importantly is that the Jewish people as a people, I mean, as a body with their leadership, have not acknowledged Christ, Yeshua, as the King of Kings, as the Messiah. And I think that this also represents that when that happens, the liberation of the energy of the civilization of the Jewish people of Israel will liberate so much love that will be the end. That moment. So the importance of the Jews is like, it's twofold. It's very negative and it's ultimately very positive. It is a paradox of a people because in releasing their resistance to God and in acknowledging their error, because there's a lot of pride in amongst Jewish people in acknowledging the error of not recognizing their Messiah, their King of Kings. There will be release of all this pent up energy, all this hate, all this violence, all this stuff that we're seeing. Of course, I'm saying this, it will happen. Nobody knows exactly what will happen, including myself. But I feel this really strongly, that to liberate amongst the people will resolve like wildfire. It will bring a big change in humanity like wildfire. So, and that's a very hopeful thought. And I do think that it will be at the very end. You know, like the Q drop, save Israel for last. Do you know that one? Are you familiar with that Q drop?
Not familiar with that.
Well, I think it means partially, I don't know exactly what Q meant by that, but for me, it works well with what I've come to understand or believe, is that the Jews will get it last, because when they get it represents the time of the new age. So first of all, killing Jews is a terrible idea, because it will
killing anybody.
Well, killing it, of course. But what I want to just emphasize right now is focusing on the destruction of Jewish people and calling for the death of Israel and the death of, which is what we hear a lot from, the pro-Palestinian side, and people that are, let's say, recognizing some of the problems on the planet from the JQ, right? It's a really bad idea if we want a messianic age where we live in the love of the divine, because the Jewish people will further increase their hardened shell and armor against the world, because the world has come at them so often. It just doubles down, triples down on their belief that the world is not safe, and that keeps them separated from the world. We want the Jewish people to open their hearts and be within the world, just like anybody else. So that will prolong the time of the Messianic age to attack Jews. So what a sensitive situation, because we got to talk about the problem that does exist at the upper echelons of power. And we also have to be sensitive that there is such a knee-jerk reaction amongst Jewish people to be very sensitive in a way that I can fully understand of what is actually real anti-Semitism. During the Black Lives Matter big uprisings and violence and breaking of stores and industry and stuff like that, a lot of Jews experienced uncensored hatred towards them. Like, you're next Jew. Like, a lot of Jews had that. So the Black Lives Matter movement has this really strong hatred, and in their doctrine is this idea that Israel is like an apartheid state and like a genocide, like these words like genocide and apartheid state. And these are
like the BLM thing is just a re-engineering of the exact same program that the Spielbergs of the world gave to Jewish people with Schindler's List and other fictions. So there's, the exact same playbook. And this happened. You can actually go back in time to the birth of Christianity, and the same thing happens there, where there's the seeding of a mythos of Roman persecution against Christians, creating a victimhood currency for this new world order to be built on. This is a play. This is something that has been part of social engineering to direct society and keep the wealth differentials in the same positions for generation after generation. This is not an old playbook. So that's where my interest is in this, is to let's break the mysticism aside, which is all very interesting. Like
Yeah.
let's break the belief in victimhood as a currency. That's where it's at for me, because like
Well,
there's not a single record of any Roman law or codex that gives any kind of persecution against Christians. It's all allowed. It's all fine. But there's a mythos that's created. And the same thing gets done with slaverism. The same thing gets done with the Holocaust. It's all a playbook where it's something that happened to people before you were even here, but you're owed something for it. And it's your excuse for why you can perpetrate bad behavior on others because you were victimized. It's like,
yeah, sure. But
again and again, that does happen.
You're putting a lot of emphasis on the victimhood as a play of the elite, let's say. Well, I don't like.
Right. I think that's like beyond anybody that is or isn't Jewish. And I also like the rhetoric that Owen Benjamin has for Jews, where he categorizes them into subgroups of, you have your war Jews, that's like government Jews. You have your sodomy Jews, that's the Hollywood ones. And you got your deli Jews, which is like all the regular, just good folks that practice the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
And I appreciate
deli
that too.
Jews?
I think that's
deli Jews, like a deli, like where you get your pastrami sandwich or something.
Yeah. Just good regular folks.
Well, okay. So let me just say this, because there might be, in my opinion, you're bringing in a little bit of an imbalance in what you're saying. So first of all, what I fully agree with you is that victim mentality, even if you suffered in your present life, you don't want to walk around feeling like a victim, because something happened to you that happened for a reason, and you learn something from that. And when you understand the reason that it happened, you release the karmic energies such that it doesn't, God willing, doesn't have to happen again. Number one, when you do believe, like when a people believes, when a people holds fear against the world, and this people is any people, but certainly with Jewish people is a very strong IQ, and the energy of the mind is very powerfully manifesting. So when you have this belief amongst the people,
they're like culturally really good storytellers. So that's the whole root of the problem, is the stories we tell ourselves, and they can tell a really convincing story. So like it makes it it's really strong with them as a people. I agree with that.
And they themselves are convinced and have literally energy of fear towards the world. Like what's happening right now, like the Jewish people in Israel are fighting on 7 fronts. 7 fronts with people that, and when I don't want to say people, like not the Palestinian people, but organizations that have been created for the purpose of annihilating the Jews. That's in their manifesto. There's no question about it. So what we have here is the actual manifestation of the fear and the belief. And it's actual. So there's a realism there that we have to be sensitive about, but also, why is it happening? Well, it's happening because of this fear. So I agree with you with that. I 100% agree that the victim mentality is not going to serve anybody, and we need to get it out of there. But I'm also sensitive to a denial of the past suffering. Like, in order to get past victim mentality, it doesn't necessarily mean to deny those things which have occurred that have caused people to suffer. So, like just saying, because you called it a mythos, does that mean that Christians didn't suffer at the hands of the Romans? Does that mean that, many, many Jewish people didn't die during the Holocaust? Because these things I know to be a fact. If you look at humanity right now, it's not hard to extrapolate the possibility that many Christians died at the hands of Romans, right? Like,
well, I'll call it mythos because there's a gap that will never be able to be crossed between the reality of what may have happened at a previous time that we weren't present for, and the story of it that people carry in their psyche and in their cultural memory. That gap, we might not know how far that gap is, but there is a gap there. And there's just as good enough reason to deny, I guess. I don't want to say full denial, but to like lower the threshold of what that persecution or that suffering was through the historical record as there is a reason to inflate it, because what we have are stories handed down on scraps of paper or whatnot, right? Like there's not a lot that we can actually go on to affirm or prove that. So it is a mythos in the sense that the only reality that the history has to us is in story form. And that story is, putty in the hands of the teller. And so that makes it a mythos. Now something happens, how much or what, we just can't know that. But so it's not about a denial. It's just about, let's just remove our focus from that.
Sure.
And bring it back to here. Like, this isn't right now that it's happening.
Sure. I'm just sharing with you my perspective to bring some of like what I would like to see as a more responsibly handled perspective in regards to this, because to call the Holocaust a mythos, like I'm very familiar with the ideas that 6 million Jews didn't die. And, there was no gas chambers. That wasn't true. And like that kind of thing. I'm aware of that, but we do have the firsthand account of quite a few Jewish people that were survivors that witnessed what occurred. And to deny their firsthand account is to say, well, they were just engineered by the same people and they were manipulated to just create this false narrative. I don't buy that one single bit.
It's tricky because there are some that have been caught in lying about their accounts. And that doesn't mean that all the accounts are discredited, but it just means that when someone throws the story at you of 6 million or gas chambers, that we have to take all of it with a grain of salt. I can't deny what I don't know firsthand one way or the other. I have a great grandfather who was part of liberating the Auschwitz camp, and he had stories about that. So I'm not denying that something happened and that there was suffering and bad stuff happening.
Yeah.
But when we root all of our cultural victim currency on like these specifics, and it was so horrible, and they made me ride a roller coaster into a bear's cage, and I got attacked by an eagle, and then they jerked me off to death. Or like, there's all kinds of crazy stories, man. Like it gets so out of control. And that's where I want to just put I know I have no control over that, but I just I call it a mythos because it does have mythological ramifications. It operates on the cultural psyche the same way that foundational myths operate. Now, whether or not even crazy myths like a trickster coyote making humanity out of an ear of corn have some reality to it in actual historicity or not, we don't know that any better than what actually happened 120 years ago, 80 years ago, 2000 years ago, because we weren't there. So I'm not trying to argue with you, but because I see where you're coming from too. I mean, there's definitely some shit that went down that was not pleasant. And that leaves, I think there's actually a bigger context to this, which, because maybe this is a fun thing to transition to. Yeah. This is such a juicy topic, but there's a book. There's a researcher I really like, Michael Tessarion, and he has a book called Dragon Mother, which is about the taboo subject of female psychology and the relationship, the really crucial relationship of mother to child in utero and in the very beginning of life. And what he talks about he goes and references the work of a lot of Jung's associates that didn't ever get much historical credit for their discoveries, like Erich Fromm and guys like that. Basically, he threads together all these different kind of obscure psychologists in their research, along with the theory of catastrophism, talking about world ages. And basically his thesis is that whatever happened in the age of catastrophes, this flood myth, right? Something along those lines, or maybe multiple events that caused humanity to have the sense of nature is not actually a safe bet, this world isn't actually just a perfect paradise, that the echoes of that trauma have been passed down from mother to child every generation and have never actually been rectified. and that what we're playing out in all of our social problems is actually just the continuation of an unsolved like flood trauma, which is now that's where it gets really interesting to me, because you can see that in the microcosm with the Holocaust, that we're playing out unresolved trauma from this event that's even closer to us historically, but maybe that's just sort of a aftershock of an even bigger event that humanity has yet to face. And
you mean like the flood of the flood that ended the civilization of Atlantis, that's referred to as the time of Noah and all that stuff? Because there's some deep mysteries here, because at that time, my gosh, I don't know if you want to get into that, but there's some mind-boggling mysteries from the Torah that show that segue beautifully into this. I just wanted to share one thing with you about this, and then we can branch into this, looking at a deeper trauma, which is an interesting theory. I haven't encountered that yet, so you just introduced that to me. It's very interesting. If you let's say people deny the Holocaust. You see, this is where I think people are being a little bit irresponsible. And this is what people tend to do with the swinging of the pendulum. So in discovering certain things, and everything becomes a conspiracy around the Jewish situation. So even the Holocaust is like part of the conspiracy, because Jews, the reason for the establishment of the state of Israel was after the Holocaust. So Jews needed a homeland. So that's been definitely spun to show that, well, it never really happened. And they have victim mentality just to justify coming in and colonizing this land that wasn't theirs. And
I definitely wouldn't go that far.
Okay, but I've heard that multiple times by multiple presenters. So this is how far it can go, because okay, so let's say I don't know where I stand with it. I have looked at some of the evidence and some of the people presenting about the Holocaust and how many Jews actually died, and were there gas chambers.
The number seems high for the amount of people that just existed in Europe at the time. But I don't want to get hung up on the numbers, because I
just want to say one last thing about that.
Sure.
There were enough people that did die, and whether it was in the manner that was spoken, for me, is not the point. Is that, because let's say we're looking at Jewish people, they are sensitive to this stuff. So to deny the Holocaust is like a bit of an extreme stance to take, versus saying, okay, look, well, maybe the manner in which the Germans killed Jews is not exactly what we think. But there was a show. You ever hear of the Montel Williams show that was on like in the 80s?
Well, maybe the point here is that people will, because of the sensitivity and I don't want to call it woke culture about stuff like this, and the attempts to protect the victim, that as soon as there's questions asked about is that really how it happened? Is that really how many? That becomes you're denying the whole thing. And
right. And I think that again,
not really the case, but there are also on the other side, there's exaggerators. And because the victims in this circumstance are the ones that are protected, the exaggerations get shielded and even inevitably potentially accepted. Whereas the questioning and possibly revising of those exaggerations is seen as an attack. And,
yes, exactly.
But there's actually no profit in it. There's no profit in either side, exaggerating or denying. It's more like, how do we resolve the echoes of this trauma? Because regardless of what exactly happened, and why I call it a foundational myth for a culture, is because the effect on their psyche is as if it was really 6 million, and it was really gas chambers, and it was really the whole nine. So we have to treat it as if it was exactly like that in terms of getting people out of their trauma cycle. That's maybe a good middle ground to meet in.
Well, that is possibly a good way. I just wonder, I'd like to ask the question to you, to myself, and to anybody listening. is it helpful to acknowledge one's trauma in the release of the trauma? So if somebody, let's say, was raped, and is it good to go there? Is it good to go into the rape in order to release it? I would actually say that it's necessary. So what has occurred, I still think that what has occurred is important in moving forward and acknowledging it. Now, I also agree with you, Chance, 100%. Just like Jews should be allowed, people should be allowed to criticize Jews, the Holocaust people should be allowed to scrutinize that and look at it. But what I was going to tell you about the Montel Williams show is that he had a couple of Jews. One was Jewish, one wasn't. They were Holocaust deniers. And then they had a few Jews who had gone through the Holocaust. They were survivors. So it was very interesting to juxtapose these two people. One of the survivors said that he grew up in a village that had like a little shtetl. Jews were like thrown in these little villages, like forced to live in squalor. The population of the village was 44,000 people at the beginning of the Holocaust, the war. And at the end, there was 200 people left alive. So if you question whether or not there was gas chambers, there's no denying that there was a lot of loss of life for people just because they were Jewish. They were herded into very not good areas. So the point is, what I'm making is that if we are going to scrutinize the past and criticize it, fine. Revision, fine. I'm all for that. But to just call it all a mythos is, for me, an irresponsibility. The word mythos is powerful. It's saying it's just a myth. I'm all about, like,
it acts like a mythos. That's what I mean. I'm not saying it's just a mythos, but it operates on the psyche like a mythos.
But when you first presented it, it did sound to me like it was a mythos. Like it doesn't, because when I hear mythos, I hear, well, that's not real. There's no reality there. So
that helps me with my communication, because
sure.
I'm thinking of it one way, but I can only say so much in a sentence, and then how it's received on the other side. I want to improve my rhetoric. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And in terms of the question of going into the trauma to resolve it, my opinion is that it's helpful to revisit the trauma in the resolution only if you come to a place where you recognize how the trauma affected your behavior, your perception of your own personality, who you are, your expectations about what life is and what life is going to have as potentials. If you just go into the trauma and revisit it and you never actually figure out how it influenced you on the personality level, the belief system level, the expectation level, then all you're doing is picking open a scab, in my opinion.
Yes.
So you really got to get to how it affected our behavior. And that's all I want when I bring up the JQ is like, how is this acting like a mythos in terms of how it affects their behavior now? And if we could bring light to that question, then people could come back to choice about it. Because right now, in the fear of they're going to come after us, they're going to act as if they're being come after. They're going to go into the perpetrator side of victimhood, and the cycle will continue. It will invite the very circumstances that they're afraid of, and then we'll just repeat this whole thing. And that's what I want to stop. I don't want that
exactly.
to happen.
So now what I'm saying is that the answer is not because we want to stop the victimhood. The answer is not to say there's not ever been any victimization. Like there hasn't ever been that. Like that's not the answer. And I've heard people say that. That's why I'm bringing that message. What's interesting also is the complexity of this Jewish thing is very funny, because the media, the mainstream media, plays both sides, right? It plays both sides. And so does the so-called devil. It plays to your strengths and it plays to your weaknesses. So the Jewish people are depicted, and I do not like this at all, on the wokey side of things, like as the victims of hatred and anti-Semitism, which I do not like at all. I mean, like yuck, like don't go there whatsoever. And then at the same time, the Jewish people in the land of Israel are depicted as the victimizer, and the woke media portrays the Palestinians as the poor victims of this perpetrator of violence in that way, which is not balanced. So it's interesting that both sides are played. The media plays both sides. It adds to the complexity.
It's cognitive dissonance, which is the grounds for dysfunction.
That's right. Absolutely. Because you can't, like, we're used to calm the nervous system. We're used to like having answers that we can wrap our minds around. And there's no way to wrap one's mind around the depiction of the situation in the Middle East unless you just take a very clear side. And then you're like, oh, the Palestinians are the victims and the Jews are the perpetrators. Or the Jews are just defending themselves against Hamas and they're the victims of Hamas. And like that. So it's like this is a very Ahrimanic form of energy, is to separate into categories to wrap one's mind around. But those different categories, there's no way that any resolution will ever occur because it's not the full picture. It's just this scatterization or the splitting down the middle. Hey, maybe that's why the kids are coming in with problems right down the middle, is because our society is being split right down the middle. You know,
constantly. I mean, this election was the most divisive yet.
Yeah.
I mean, just rampant hatred. Like, it's really crazy to see.
It was so divisive. And, you know, it's interesting because I still think that.
I think you're onto something there. I think it's like the divisive nature of our society in the way that that's leveraged intentionally is itself, being represented in the kids coming in with the midline mutations.
That's right. It's an interesting theory, possible hypothesis.
To riff on that in context with Jews being in, positions of power and influence in a disproportionate representation. If we're going to accept that is the case, which at least statistically it is, and I can't speak for other people and their motivations, but if I was to try to put myself in their shoes based on the context of everything we're talking about and how this trauma creates a behavior, I would say that maybe there's the intentional, it's kind of a anti-Semitic trope, right? The poisoning of the well, intentional poisoning of the well in medicine, in food, in media, and what goes into people's consumption in their mind as a way to weaken a potential enemy before they would become an enemy, as like a way to manage the goyim so that they never have the strength or the health, the vitality to raise a hand against their Jewish masters.
Right.
And if the thing about that is it only lasts so long, it only can go for so far because the nature of life is to be resilient and adapt. So despite the poisoning of a well, you will create a generation that becomes immune to the poison and figures out who's doing it. And then there's a reckoning. And then that group is the one who's got the victimhood mythos in their foundational cultural story. And it's just we just stay in this polarization and division, and it never gets us to the messianic age of just pure crushing and everybody's getting it, which is what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll take what you've just presented because it does have logical. It's like there's some logical foundation for what you're presenting. I'll take it into consideration. I could tell you, Chance, that I don't think that the Jewish people, that the Jews that are involved in these upper echelons of control are the masters, the number one masters. I think the Jews are, what word can I use here?
Bagman.
What's that?
The bagman.
The pawns, the bagmen, the
scapegoat. They're they're the shield. They're a shield.
Well, scapegoat. Right. Exactly. So the world can look and say Jew, when the real perpetrators can go unseen. And that really does resonate strongly with the whole Jewish, well, I'm going to use your word here, mythos of victimhood, is that it works in that very same way, is that if you point the finger at Jew, well, that's what Jews feel like the way the world sees them. So it works perfectly. It's a very
the motivations I described would work to get them to be the bagman for some other force pulling the strings, for sure.
Yes, right. But there's another possible argument here. Jews are pretty shrewd. There's been a very strong emphasis in Jewish families for educating their kids. So there's a long line of education. And Joseph himself represents the Jewish people, represents the people themselves, because he's first seen as better in the eyes of his father. So chosen people. He gets thrown out. There's jealousy from the nations. He's sold into slavery. And he ends up rising into second in command of Egypt. So the reason why I don't believe that the Jewish people, the Jews that are in the positions of power and in the uppity ups of these big companies, these big corporations, is because Joseph himself is symbolic of the Jewish people. And he was not Pharaoh. He was the first in command after Pharaoh. So I think that these Jews in positions of authority and positions of power are symbolic of being like Joseph was the second in command of the land of Egypt, which at the time was the most powerful civilization on earth at that time.
When I referred to them as bagmen, I didn't really give context to why I said that way, right? But they're obviously involved in the financial world and banking, and that's kind of like, well, yeah, they are controlling the money, but it's other people's money. So that's an example. But actually, if you go back to the Templars, who had all kinds of influence over European society for a long time, the Jews were their accountants. A lot of the Templars, the ones that actually owned the wealth, were like illiterate, and they had Jews doing their money stuff, running their system.
It was against the law for Christians to loan money, but the Jews didn't consider it against their law, so they became money lenders at that time. Right.
So they also become like a scapegoat. There's all kinds, like there's this weird repetition of it over and over again.
Yeah, it is a weird.
Them like stepping into the role to do the dirty thing that, and then also take the blame for it. But it's really like something that everybody's involved in. You know, back to the Pharmakos example, and the Pharmakos being the scapegoat. But like, you didn't have to take the pill, you didn't have to take the shot.
Right.
It was always just an offer, and that's the best way to get out of the belief that like the Jews are doing it to you.
Like you're a victim of this Jewish conspiracy.
You're making them your God. They make offers, and those offers are based on demands, you know?
Right.
Like, so it's the same with like Hamas and Israel, who it doesn't matter who started the beef. It's like, you just step out of the binary. It doesn't matter if the demand was there for the allopathy that is causing all this rampant disease, and then the offer was answered, or if the offer was given and the demand arose out of that through marketing. It doesn't matter if the GMO foods were created to poison you, or if the GMO foods were created to answer a demand for cheap and fast food. Right. It doesn't matter. It's probably the latter. It's probably from the ground up, not the top down. That's my perception of how everything tends to work. So that means that it has to start with us on the ground level to revoke our consent and decline the offers. And the honorable way to decline the offer is to say, I'll accept your offer on the condition that you fulfill my condition, rather than just no, or, attack the other.
Right.
So that what I mean by that is like with to stay in honor with the way the system is right now. It doesn't matter the demographic of who's in charge of what. It doesn't matter at all who holds the bag or who's got the amount of resources flowing through their system. at the end of the day, we always control if we want to stay honorable, we always control the people that supposedly control us by our participation and consent. So like, look at the way that the options for food are changing in grocery stores, that there's more options for organic and non-GMO food. That's a direct result of less people accepting the offer to buy the mass-produced and highly processed garbage.
Absolutely.
And so that's all that has to continue, is you just keep changing your behavior and keep, accepting the offers that are good for you and revising that when you need to. And the so-called tormentors, masters, what have you, they will change their tune. The end of the day, the secret about the Jewish question that is completely left out of the conversation is that they are serving us. Like, they're serving us in terms of the ones that are in these positions of power. People want to see the movies people want the pornography, people, all of the stuff. Like they're buying it. They're asking for it.
Well, which is true for any leader. It's true for any leader, that the leader is put there by the consciousness of the people. I think that there's a positive message here that I'd like to leave on this JQ thing, which I'd like to share as a kind of a prediction on my part. Again, using the model of Joseph to represent the Jewish people, but he also represents the Christ. Because that line, Ula Kalkon Nazir Echav, it's, I won't get into too much, but there are some theories that Jesus was a Nazirite and Nazir because he refused to drink the vinegar when he was in the Passion. I'll just leave that at a side for something very interesting to look at. But the fact that both Moses's blessings of the 12 tribes and Jacob's predictions for the end of days come together in Joseph as this exact same phrases, it shows the emphasis of the importance of Joseph. The story of Joseph teaches us a lot. Joseph is responsible for basically amassing a large amount of food to store in the storehouses for the coming of the famine. And so when the famine is there, the storehouses are opened and there's an abundance that happens during a time of famine. So what I'd like to predict, because Joseph represents the second in command over the power structure. So the Pharaoh is behind the scenes, the number one command, but Joseph is like the Jewish people in these positions of power, that when the time is right, these storehouses of wealth, of gold, will be released to the whole people for a time of abundance. So even though there is like a kind of like, I think it's a very positive prophecy.
That actually ties into the entire idea of the Messianic age, that it also contextually has to do with the day of rest in the 7 days of creation and the 1,000-year period that the earth will lie fallow. Yeah. And but yet paradoxically, it's a Messianic epoch. It's like there's a paradox in that. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, the day of rest, first of all, the Sabbath represents stopping all work that you've been doing for those 6 days of the work week. It also represents that stillness where there's no work to be done. Everything's okay just as it is.
So it's like the generative stillness. Back to that.
It's the generative stillness. And it's also the time to enjoy without any need. It's the wounds are healed, the needs are fulfilled. This thing, like this shortage and scarcity, and creating the false reality of scarcity, and through competition and the control of pricing and stuff like that, that will be released back to the people. And I think we'll have also the release of a lot of the things that have been stored in secret, like in the Vatican and stuff like that, of amazing miraculous things that could help heal illness and that create energy, like Tesla's inventions that haven't gotten to the market that could create energy by tapping into the ionosphere and earth ground to create tremendous power for electric motors that run ad perpetua. stuff like that. So I do think we are coming to a great holy time. I do think that the Jewish people have this dualistic role of creating and mending, and we could say again, there is a problem, a half truth of that, because all people, that's true for all people. Really, it's true for every single person. But when we're on the JQ topic, it's interesting to see that in the 12 tribes, in the prophecies for the 12 tribes, you see the violence, you see the commercial dwellings, the commercial shenanigans. Then you also see this promise for abundance and healing and the Christ. So that's how I perceive things. And I think the next few years are going to be very interesting as Pluto digs its teeth more and more into the Aquarian picture. This will be tolerated less and less. Like with the force of a bomb, like people will be tolerating this less and less.
I think they'll be renovating the whole system of supply chains. I mean, it's already happening. People are growing their own food, creating their own networks outside of what's, being less fragile to if there's some sort of collapse, that they know their neighbors that are making things, and there are a lot of people trying to do that already. Yeah. Yeah. I am very hopeful about the future as well. I mean, I can see things getting ugly with the bomb going off, metaphorically speaking. But I don't think it's necessarily like, because Pluto moves so slowly, maybe there will be some pivotal moments of intensity, but I think it'll be like just a continual disillusion of that which wasn't working. And this conversation, I think, was really helpful for people that have, I'm sure by this point, heard all kinds of answers to the JQ or conversations about it. To be able to have a nuanced talk on the subject, respectful talk, not always necessarily agreeing, but working to find the truth in each other's statement as we did. I appreciate that. Like, this was valuable to me to improve my rhetoric and my expectations of what will happen. And ultimately, though, like, the Jews as a special people whose salvation or damnation is intrinsically tied to the world's regeneration, I don't know that I would go that far in so much just to say that they represent in the collective psyche that element, but it's really about all of us going through this transformative process, not about the Jews doing it. It just so happens that they're the ones holding a lot of the chess pieces in terms of resources, and that whether it's from a top down or a ground up, I think it will be both sides maybe working to meet in the middle, that the transformative element of disposing the victimhood currency and creating a new model through which we can do business with each other will be important for all of us, whether or not you have a particular religion or a particular skin color. Because as I said, like, it's happened with the same kind of engineering has been done to BLM, and it will continue to be done to, they tried to do it with Asians Matter at one point and it didn't really take, but it's a playbook. And I want everyone to see that that's a playbook for social engineering and wealth redistribution that we don't need. And I guess I could go on and on ranting about it, but Daniel, there's actually a whole page of notes of topics on electroculture and holistic counseling that we didn't even touch. So if you would be so kind as to accept my invitation to come back and maybe do one of my Wednesday night live streams where we can get into that, let's do it soon, because that stuff was kind of fresh on my mind. But it was good to have a full conversation about this topic so that we could really explore around the edges of it and find the spiritual center of it, as we did in the second hour. So I appreciate that. And just good hanging with you as usual. It's always interesting.
Yeah, me too, man. I appreciate the chance to talk these things out. I think, even if I think we agreed on many ways and we're expressing different things sometimes in different ways. I think it's very good to have this conversation in this fashion. And just for the very reason that we were talking about how suppression leads to outward manifestation of violence and stuff like that. So that's very, very handy. I truly appreciate it. And talking about electroculture, when you first were introducing the age of like Pluto moving through Aquarius, you mentioned some things like electricity and magnetism for growing crops, which is literally electroculture. What electroculture is, I was like, oh, we're going to talk about electroculture today. So the fact that we haven't, I'd be happy to do that and come on and talk about holistic counseling and electroculture, because electroculture is really cool, man. It teaches us a lot about.
Yeah, I had like a whole scheme of weaving those concepts together.
Yeah. Well, we tackle the doozy of a topic, so I'm not surprised that it took us a long time. Not that we've gotten to the full bottom of it, but to kind of bring it a little bit full circle, because you can't. I don't think you could really like open up the JQ question and just leave it like, on. It's
not a soundbite thing. The problem is that it needs the nuance and it doesn't get it.
Exactly. It needs the nuance. It doesn't get it. And I hope that this will have, it will help bring the nuance, because nuance is a good word for the balance of opposites, right? It is a good word there. So
it's a good word for getting the other half of the truth too.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So good. Thank you for your time and for your knowledge, your attentiveness. You're holding this space. I look forward to that, to sharing about my body healing, why the mind is so powerful through the modality of the V's dialogue that I teach and that I practice, and then electroculture. That sounds like a nice invite. Thanks.
Yeah, man, we'll do it. We'll have a
all right, great.
Maybe I would say maybe we'll invite Topher, but maybe not. Because I want to ask you about it, but I do like having you on with Topher. But we gotta wrap this up sometime. Where can people find you?
They could find me. Probably the easiest way to find me would be at Dr. Moshe MOSHE.com. And I also have that's for my personal, like you want to work with me for your own healing website. And I also have the certification training, which is at Holistic without a W. So HOLISTIC -counseling with one L, COUNSELING.CA. So there you go. You can reach me through either of those website portals.
Boom. All right. Well, we crushed it. Great time hanging with you, and I look forward to doing this again much sooner.
Me too. Thanks, Chance. I appreciate it. And blessings in your fatherhood. Blessings.
Thank you. I'm itching to go pick up that baby.
Yeah, you got to go get him. It's been too long that you haven't picked him up. So
it's the little girl. I'll show you pictures after I get off the air. But all right. Thanks, everybody. See you later. All right, everybody. Thanks for sticking around all the way to the end of the episode. And I appreciate the commitment to such a sticky topic. If any audience can cover this particular conversation and stay loving and rational, but also asking questions that need to be asked, I think that it's this audience. So I'm proud of y'all for making it all the way here. And just remember, questioning is not denying. Whenever questioning gets turned into denying, you know that we're having a trauma response here, or a manipulation, or some of both. So Moshe is a champ for taking this on. I did not expect to do a 2-hour talk on it. I don't know what I expected when I brought it up right at the beginning, other than it was on my mind. And who else could I talk to about this and it feel, fair based on the rules of engagement for this subject? I liked it though. And I think that we didn't really get to the bottom of things, but we did cover with nuance what needed to be brought to nuance. So maybe before I talk about some of my other thoughts on the subject matter, we should cover what I put into the second half of this convo, which I think was a nice rounding off of the first part. I mean, we really built on the first part. It was more nitty gritty in the first hour. In the second hour, we got into the answer to the Jewish question, as you might say, is being Jesus or a savior, Messiah concept. Doesn't have to be a literal historical Jesus, by the way, but we did talk about the savior monomyth in part 2, the internal savior. Moshe brought up Rudolf Steiner and the archimonic force, that idea. And we questioned whether there's a Christly force and an antichrist force, or if there's a trickster force that embodies both. We talked about the purpose of archonic or demonic forces in our reality, whether or not God is composed of good and evil or just strictly good. We talked about problems with The Secret, that old movie I never saw, and what it means to repress negativity psychologically and somatically. Then we talked about whether or not the Nephilim are superpowered, hungry ghosts that have been hanging around on the realm without bodies for thousands of years. And then we talked about the Hermetic axiom that all truths are half-truths. What is the only begotten Son of God? And then there was some really good feeling reception of eternal renewal from the divine spring of eternal being. And I think that near the end there, we discussed whether or not scriptures can be divinely inspired. So there was a lot more like mystical, spiritual, good feeling stuff in the second half that might help you cleanse the palate of what may have seemed combative at times. I don't think that we were ever in conflict, but with these with talks like this, you got to get really clear with defining your terms. And I don't think Moshe liked it whenever I started likening the Holocaust to a mythos. And I get where he's coming from. And my only point with that wasn't to say that it didn't happen. I'm saying I don't know what happened. Something clearly happened. I don't know what. I can't put numbers on it. I wasn't there. But the way that it affects the cultural psyche of Jewish people is as a foundational story, which is exactly what mythology is. So we can have the same conversation about any myth. Is there truth to it? How much of it is true and how much of it is fabricated? But more importantly, how does it affect the psyche of the culture as a collective? That's all I meant. It works like a myth. I'm not saying that it was literally 100% myth. But, we got a problem when labeling your religion also labels a race, but is also seen as an insult to call somebody. You call somebody a Jew. It's like, are you describing my skin color? Are you describing where I'm from in the world? Are you describing my religion? Or are you saying that I'm cheap? I can't think of any other groups where the name of the group functions in so many ways contradictory like that. Oh yeah. And if you want part 2, of course, you got to get on my Patreon or my Rockfin page or the YouTube channel membership. Those are all of your great options for supporting me over here and my growing little family and getting yourself the more enlightened half of this conversation. I mean, the first half was great. Don't get me wrong, but there was some serious mystical juice in part 2. Now, I'm going to give an example of a story that maybe a lot of you haven't heard of, but you can look this guy up, a alleged Holocaust survivor named Herman Rosenblatt, who claimed to be a survivor and claimed to have met his wife at a concentration camp. He wrote a whole book about it, but then scholars later discovered that his story was fabricated based on several key inconsistencies and details in the story. His story was that he claimed that he met his wife Roma on the opposite side of a concentration camp fence where she would sneak him apples and bread. She was the apple of his eye, as in it all happened in his mind's eye. And Rosenblatt went on Oprah Winfrey. He made the whole circuit. He was like a kind of a Holocaust survivor celebrity. And then when scholars and relatives discovered that the story was made up, Rosenblatt admitted it, but he had no regrets and continued to tell the story in his exact words. It wasn't a lie. It was my imagination. And in my mind, I believed it. But in my mind, it was real. Now, this is one example. This doesn't mean that all survivor accounts are imaginary, but it demonstrates conclusively that the currency of victimhood and being a survivor of something like this is a very powerful and tempting payoff. If one guy did it who's to say that other people didn't do it? Not saying all people did it, but it pretty well proves the point in a singular case study. That's all. And then the problem with it is that now historians worry that these stories of fabricated Holocaust survival coming out will encourage people to deny the 6 million. And that's the problem right there, is that if you question something, then now you're a denier. And that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I think that we have a bigger problem at large with even calling somebody anti-Semitic, because the whole word Semitic is predicated on being a descendant of Shem, one of the sons of Noah. And it's not just about speaking a Semitic language. I'm going to quote from Dylan's book, my favorite of Dylan Sicoscio's Spirit World books, which I did an audiobook narration of that you can find linked in the show notes or on my website, which you can support me and Dylan and get this gravy read to you if you wanted to purchase. So he says, being Semitic is predicated on being a descendant of Shem, not just speaking a Semitic language. However, there is no such thing as a Semitic language because there is no such thing as Shem. Even the most learned of the church will admit the farce conceptualized in the word Semitic, regardless if they admit that Shem is a personification, parentheses, of the Son. Archbishop Trench wrote, "It was Eichhorn who first suggested the calling of a certain group of languages which stand in a marked contradistinction to the Indo-European or Aryan family by the common name of Semitic. A word which should include all of these was wanting, and this one was handy and has made its fortune, at the same time implying, as Semitic does, that these are all languages spoken by races which are descended from Shem. It is eminently calculated to mislead. There are non-Semitic peoples, the Phoenicians, for example, which have spoken a Semitic language. There are Semitic races which have not spoken one." So this just draws out the point that the whole concept of Semites is shrouded in confusion and contradiction. Are we talking about a language group, or are we talking about a descent from a particular mythological figure? Absolutely, positively a mythological figure. I mean, we've done entire huge 4-hour Inner World episodes about Noah and all of the versions of Noah, aka Bacchus, that exist throughout the world. I think that's episode 8 of Inner World. That one is worth the price of admission to my Patreon for, I'll tell you what. And going back to an earlier time than the modern Hebrew faith, before things took such a literal turn, when there was more of a, melting pot for the Jews with the Greeks. And in fact, the Greeks also were a big melting pot with the Indians. There's an entire, very, very rarely spoken about part of history, including the Greco-Buddhist Empire. And I have a theory that I'm working on. I just haven't come to a place where I can present all of the case like a legal argument. But I think that the Jewish religion originated as a type of Protestant revolution of Hinduism. Not that they're Protestants, but the way that Protestantism split off from Catholicism as an attempt to simplify and purify and remove idolatry. I think the same thing happened with Judaism from Hinduism. It's a theory. But when you go back to one of the very earliest Jewish philosophers that we have writings on, Philo of Alexandria. Interesting stuff, by the way. And then you put this in context with the idea of the Jewish literalism around the Messianic age. And, whether or not Christianity and Judaism are even different, other than that they've expanded on the story and created the Jesus figure to sit in for the Logos, to be the Logos. Well, Philo was a Jew. There was no Jesus yet at this time, but he wrote on a bunch of stuff that ends up becoming the New Testament. And this is again from A God's Acre from Wins for the Soul, where Dylan has listed out, 30 bullet points of Yeah, 35, 35 examples of something that Philo of Alexandria says about the Logos that ends up being transcribed word for word somewhere in the New Testament. So there's really no difference here. But Philo calls the Logos the Son of God, the second divinity, the first begotten of God, the image of God, superior to angels and all the world, by whom the world was created, the substitute of God, the light of the world and intellectual Son, the most ancient of God's works and before all things, eternal, the preserver and perfecter of the world, free from all taint of sin, voluntary or involuntary. The Logos is the fountain of wisdom, a messenger sent from God, the advocate for mortal men, the shepherd of God's flock, the physician who heals all evil. I mean, it goes on and on. I won't read them all, but Philo is an interesting one to study. A Jewish philosopher of 20 BCE to 50 CE. So not only is he before Christ in a way, but he would have been contemporary to Jesus. You would think he might have written something about it. You'd think that story, if it was literally true in history, would have made it into a guy like this' writings, because it was his entire focus was writing about the Logos. You'd think if the Logos incarnated, that would be a big deal. So Philo writes about the Genesis account being an allegory, writes about the Logos, the divine order or divine reason that's the blueprint through which God creates the universe. All kinds of stuff. According to ChatGPT, Philo's blending of Greek and Jewish thought had a lasting impact on Jewish philosophy, early Christian theology, and even Islamic philosophy. His allegorical method of interpreting scripture influenced thinkers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria. However, his works fell out of favor in mainstream Judaism, which leaned more towards literal interpretation and rabbinic tradition. Yeah, that sounds about right. Kind of interesting how, in context with all the Melchizedek gravy we've got into lately, that Philo of Alexandria talks about the Logos being a high priest who's a mediator between God and humanity. Basically, the exact same thing as Melchizedek, or as Jesus, when Jesus is compared to Melchizedek in the New Testament book of Hebrews. So why I'm describing all this is because the Jewish people had the Savior. They had the Logos. It was part of their philosophical tradition. And then the rabbinic strategy shifted towards literalism and this sort of like completely separate intellectual God and this time-bound constraint of waiting for a savior to come that hasn't come yet. So I don't think that did them any favors. And even though like it's kind of sounds like a joke when Moshe says that the answer to the Jewish question is Jesus, if you listen to the second half of this talk, you'll see more what we mean in terms of how to connect to that, how to answer that without it needing to be a literal or even the exact same version of the Logos as Jesus. Just to know that this first begotten of God, the light of the world, the intellectual Son, the Logos, the divine reason that is the blueprint for all things, is a force and an energy that you can connect to within yourself and feel at any time and get yourself out of the constraints of beginnings and ends and time itself, and just realize that, hey, that which gives me my soul, that which animates me, is the exact same as that which animates the entire universe. I have no beginning. I have no end to fear. Great. That's my best shot at it. And that goes completely against the idea of the whole world wants to kill me. I'm separate from the world. I'm special and chosen, and that makes everybody want to hurt me. And I know not all Jewish people are like that, but what does it do to a child when they're handed the Holocaust story at an early age and it's beat into their head over and over again? Do you think that makes it easier or harder for them to feel the essential unity between their soul and all soul of the entire world and all other people? I don't think it helps. I don't think that it's doing any favors. So maybe we shouldn't make such a big Hollywood level deal out of the Holocaust. Maybe we shouldn't call people deniers who ask questions about it and just want to know a more accurate history of the event. Questioning is not denying. Questioning doesn't mean hate. Making fun doesn't mean hate. In fact, for a lot of people, making fun of each other is how they show love to each other. So it's really hard to love a people when you're not allowed to make fun of them either. It's like, you tell me what I have to do. And now, even if I wanted to do that before you told me I had to, now I don't really want to, right? We're all kind of like that sometimes. I'm going to have Moshe back soon. We're going to do the conversation I originally had planned for him in this talk, where we're going to talk about his, holistic counseling and electroculture and natural magnetism and all kinds of good gravy. Good gravy. We'll do that in a Vibrant. It won't be too long off. And if you guys want to get with me for some biofield tuning, I'd love to take on some new clients. Or if you're a repeat client, I'd love to work with you again. Sometimes the people that stick with me the longest get really interesting results, and we can kind of address problems as they come up instead of dragging through them for a while. A particularly great success story from a recent repeat client, one of my best, actually, one of my favorites, was that in September, we did a session to work on her body's ability to absorb calcium. She was getting, she's a older generation woman, and you know how it goes. The pre-osteoporosis thing is quite common. The body can't assimilate calcium as it needs to, starts to accumulate in the joints instead of distributing to the bones. It's very painful, or at the very least, not comfortable. And you run the risk of, as that progresses, being brittle, easy to break your bones. We did one tuning session on the calcium question, and I got with her again for a session just earlier this week. So a few months later, and she said she had seen her naturopathic doctor and that the calcium issue had totally cleared according to the tests that they ran. And she already knew that was the case because she wasn't having the joint pain when she consumed dairy. That's a great example of a tuning success story. I won't pretend like it's a guarantee or a magic bullet to solve all problems, but the potential is there to go maybe even above and beyond your expectations too. It's all in the potential, baby. So this was a really long outro to a pretty long podcast. Thanks for sticking with it. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope this conversation helps you find the way to possibly discuss delicate things of this nature with people that you care about without triggering, without making enemies, keeping everybody on the side of, we just want everyone to have the win-win in life. And thanks for all the support. Check the show notes for other ways to support the podcast. Tippecanoe Herbs is my favorite. And I'm out of here. Much love, everybody. See you on the next one. Happy Thanksgiving.
We'll be right back.